slight paradigm shift in as much as I'm going to be talking about the ethics of science, but in a similar vein to the speakers this morning, I thought I'd start off just by telling you a little bit about myself. My first degree was at UCL in 1977 in microbial genetics, and I remember my dissertation subject was the genetic combination, recombination in Caprinus lacubus, which I still remember as a particularly nasty-looking kind of mushroom. And from there I went on to read medicine. I practiced medicine for 27 years, overlapping with part-time working at St. Mary's, which became full-time in 2010, since when I've been program director in bioethics here. And for those of you who are visitors on the table with leaflets there, there is one about that particular program. And there are many organizations in hello, that was working earlier on, but now seems to be frozen, which is not terribly helpful. Yeah, nothing happening. Ah, there we are. It's just a bit slow. In fact, very slow. It's very, very slow indeed. Let's see if we can get back to the first picture. I hope it's going to materialize in a minute. There we go. This is a slide, it's a composite slide of quite a number of organizations that I know of, and certainly have been a member of the Christian Medical Fellowship for many, many years, which comprises of approximately 4,000 members in the UK, and is just one organization of dozens, if not hundreds, across the country of folk from a scientific background who also, in the case of the Christian Medical Fellowship, obviously share Christian faith. And I just did a quick web search yesterday of some of the others, and Biologos, that I've never heard of before, came up from the United States. I am familiar with Christians in Science, which on its website says it has about 1,000 members. And the Faraday Institute in St. Edmund's College in Cambridge is another organization that I've been aware of, and just recently they gained a huge grant from the Templeton Foundation, which is a very well-endowed organization that distributes hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds a year for research, amongst other things, at the interface between science and faith. And one of their little videos on their website at the moment is called Science, the Big Question. So there's plenty of interest, not just from a Christian perspective, but if you search more widely, certainly Judaism and science was a website that came at the top of the search I did a couple of days ago, and there are an awful lot of sites relating science to Islam. And just recently I had the privilege of going out to Amman, where the biggest shock for me was the way in which certainly those organizing that conference were in no way embarrassed, and rightly so, about the impact and relevance of their faith to their scientific work. And it was very interesting hearing many of the Islamic doctors speaking about the same kind of dilemmas and problems that the Christian Medical Fellowship has been concerned with over the past few years. Now, of course, that doesn't mean to say that every scientist, or even the majority of scientists, are believers. And in fact, if you do look at some of these statistics that have been done, it is a large minority, but it is a minority of scientists who believe. But it seems to me that with two children who are involved in the world of arts and are now working in film and fashion respectively, that there are far more believers in the scientific community than there are in the arts and humanities community. And perhaps one of the barriers that this relates to is not so much whether science and faith conflict, but the fact that in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, you have to humble yourself. And St. Paul tells us that there are not many mighty, not many wise who are part of the kingdom, because the more that we rely upon our own wisdom and perceived intellect, the more we have to, as it were, lay down if we are to take up our cross and follow Christ. Now, the title of my talk, Friend at the Door, Enemy at the Gate, obviously no prizes for guessing who on this slide is likely to be fairly hostile to faith, and Richard Dawkins has become one of those atheist icons of which Anthony spoke so well this morning. But even in his own university in Oxford, the character on the right is Professor John Lennox, who is Professor of Mathematics at Oxford, and who is the only Christian, I think, that Richard Dawkins has ever debated, and they've now debated twice, once in Alabama and once in Oxford. And John Lennox is a graduate of the MA program here, long before I became program director of it. And I would say that his book, as a Christian mathematician, God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God, is one of the most powerful apologetics for the reconciliation of faith and science that I've ever read. And certainly many of the ideas in this talk have been taken from that, including the first quotation, which is from Richard Lewontin, and I hope that's going to appear up there in just a moment. And Lewontin says, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense, and we heard plenty of those from Elisabetta and Ali this morning, is the key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, because we have a prior commitment to materialism. I think this was a point that Ali was making this morning too. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a materialistic explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation that produces materialistic explanations. We see the world through the color of the lenses that we use to view it. Moreover, Lewontin concludes that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now, I was fascinated by Ali's picture this morning of that engraving of the believer poking their head through the barrier of the material world into the transcendent, because as Lennox rather amusingly points out, that if you're a real materialist, not only can you not believe in the divine foot, you can't believe in the door either, because if the physical world is all there is, then there can be no doorway to anywhere else at all, because we have it all, as it were, already. Now, I think that emphasizes that the real conflict is not between science and religion, but it is between materialism and transcendence. And in the remaining time, I want to look at how that conflict between materialism and transcendence, rather than undermining my own faith in God, actually underpins it. And I would say that one of the strongest reasons for my faith, as well as the areas that have been indicated this morning in terms of the anthropic principle and so on, is that, in my view, you cannot construct a grounded morality for science or anything else without the divine foot having its imprint. Now, usually when we think about science and ethics, the fields that it covers are illustrated there. The top little figure shows the things that particularly relate to my own speciality of bioethics, where we often talk about, amongst consent and confidentiality, things like honesty, fraud, misconduct, responsibility, duty, and so on. And these things relate to research in science as much as to any other discipline. So that's one element of it. But obviously, as technological science has grown, another area that keeps bioethicists like me in business is the ethics of the application of science to real-world cases, whether it be in environmental science or, in my case, in medical science. And a number of organizations looking at the interface between ethics, science, and faith in the case of CBET has mushroomed in the past 20 years. And there's just a few of them there, the Institute for Science and Ethics in Oxford being the star on the right. And again, this is the last ad, I promise, in this talk. The CBET bulletin, the latest one is just out, and you'll find copies of those on the table with Pope Francis smiling from the front. So, no lack of interest there. But the area that I particularly want to focus on in the next 15 minutes or so is neither of those, which could take up day conferences in themselves, but to look at the meta-ethics, if you like, of the very foundations of the scientific enterprise itself, looking at what constitutes the ethics of how science works, its methods like inductivism and falsification and so on. And Dawkins, when he speaks about God, does so very powerfully, and his most famous diatribe against God begins that he is obviously the most, or arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. But of course, Dawkins, though he's entitled to his opinion and certainly shares it freely, this does not stem from the fact that he was the former professor of public understanding of science. And in fact, even many of his fellow atheists, including Michael Ruse, who is there pictured with another former atheist who may be more familiar to you by the end of the afternoon and who is sitting in this room, says that Dawkins is engaged in a moral crusade, not as a philosopher trying to establish premises and conclusions, but as a preacher telling the ways of salvation and damnation, and the God delusion is a work of morality. Now, I couldn't agree more with that, and having read The God Delusion a while back, I thought that it was a very disappointing, disgruntled book overall, and the most disappointing chapter of all is the one where Dawkins tries to establish a foundation for morality. And he spends at least half that chapter talking about how rude Christians are to him, and Christians can be extremely rude. They are rude to me sometimes. He then spends a lot of time talking about how atheists can behave in just as exemplary a fashion as Christians, again something I have no argument with, but he never really gets to grips with what he says he will deal with, and that is how you can ground ethics without God. He does have a go, and what he does say is unsurprisingly linked in with extrapolation from his evolutionary commitment, and that is that morality is hardwired into our nature, and that in his view altruism is either reciprocal or it's symbiotic or towards one's own species, and he certainly doesn't, on the surface of it, see any reason for anything other than an evolutionary viewpoint. Now, he's also very keen to gain Einstein on side and says that Einstein was an atheist, which I think is very difficult to establish, and I see Elizabeth, not surprisingly, shaking her head. And a lot of the things Einstein said are not really compatible with that. And he said, you're right in speaking of the moral foundations of science, but you can't turn it around and speak of the scientific foundations of morality. Now, Dawkins actually pretty well had the same view until recently in The Devil's Chaplain. He wrote, "It is pretty hard to defend absolute morals on anything other than religious grounds. Science has no method for deciding what is ethical." But he's recently changed his mind in the light of his fellow atheists' book of 2008, I think it is, Sam Harris's The Moral Landscape. Now, my understanding of the essence of the moral landscape is that it can be distilled into the information you have there, that according to Harris, questions about values, about meaning, morality, and larger purposes are really questions about well-being of conscious creatures. And with that as his primary thesis, he then goes on to equate goodness with human flourishing. That's nothing new under the sun. I think Aristotle had got there before him on that. And says that we can identify the causes of flourishing from science, and therefore science can tell us what is good and what is bad. Now, I've got at least 4 issues with that. I've got more issues with it, but I'm going to talk about at least 4. Now, some of you will know that since I've been doing the program here in bioethics, I got rather fond of David Hume, and one of David Hume's big points is that you can't derive an ought from an is. And there's a cup of tea with the word strychnine on it there, for those of you who may not be able to read it at the back. And science can tell you that if you put strychnine in your grandma's tea, it will kill her, and these days it can delineate the precise biochemical details of her demise. But science cannot possibly say anything at all about whether it is ethical for you to gain your inheritance by this means or not. Now, Harris, to give him his due, does recognize this. And in order to get around it, he broadens the meaning of science. And instead of using it in the common and narrow sense of the natural sciences, which we were largely talking about this morning, he explains that he is speaking of the broader Latin use of the word scientia, meaning knowledge. In German, the word Wissenschaft probably comprises what he's talking about, where Wissenschaft is any academic discipline that includes research in the natural sciences, linguistics, philosophy, theology, and humanities in general. And Harris states that he's using science in this broad sense of rational thought. Well, fair enough. But if that's the case, then there is no problem in deducing or grounding morality, because that understanding of science includes theology, the queen of the sciences. So there is not a problem. However, he uses a second sleight of mind, as Lennox, I think, rather cleverly calls it, when he states, "I'm arguing that in the moral sphere, it is safe to begin with the premise that it is good to avoid behaving in such a way as to produce the worst possible outcome for everyone." Now, most readers just quickly skimming through the book and reading that would agree with him and move on, without noting that he does not say in the scientific sphere, but in the moral sphere. So he presupposes an a priori moral principle and then uses science to determine how a particular situation relates to that moral principle. But this, I suggest, is not using science to determine moral values, but using science to assess an issue against a moral value that is already presupposed. And that is a very different thing. And then there's a third sleight of hand that is picked up by the biologist Paul Zachary Myers in his review of the moral landscape. He writes this: I don't think Harris's criterion that we can use science to justify maximizing the well-being of individuals is valid, because we can't. We can certainly use science to say how we can maximize well-being once we have defined well-being. But Harris smuggles in an unscientific prior into his category of well-being. Now, Harris has responded to this criticism by saying that we can't define physics, for example, without recourse to prior assumptions. Now, this, of course, is perfectly true. But if the prior which Harris uses is a moral one, then he cannot say that he is grounding his morality in science. By the same token, he cannot also rule out the prior assumption of God. The philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah, in the New York Times review of Harris's book, exposes this knight's move when he asks, how do we know that the morally right act is, as Harris posits, the one that does the most to increase well-being, defined in terms of our conscious state of mind? Has science revealed that? Of course it hasn't. That is a moral statement. And then in his critique of Harris's book, John Horgan says that Harris's concept of a science of human flourishing is, in his view, a dangerous one. He writes, just 100 years ago, Marxism and eugenics struck many reasonable people as brilliant fact-based schemes for improving human well-being. These pseudo-scientific ideologies culminated in two of the most lethal regimes in history, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Harris repeatedly suggests that we should not rule out the scientific revelation of objectively true universal morality just because it is not possible yet. As long as this achievement is possible in principle, Harris says, we shouldn't worry that it's not possible in practice. But, says Horgan, we live in the world of practice, where even the smartest, best informed, best intentioned people make terrible mistakes, and I therefore fear for the practical consequences of a scientific movement to derive a universal morality. I share, as a medic, Horgan's concerns, and it seems to me that, reflecting back on a career of almost 30 years, that in medical ethics I have seen two trajectories developing alongside one another with varying strengths in different parts of the world. And certainly the materialist strand in medicine in Europe has been one that is in the ascendant at the moment, where humans are just one species amongst many other, and the value of life is increasingly being evaluated in terms of its quality, and the weak sacrificed for the strong. Whereas a theistic, and certainly a Christian theistic viewpoint, though shared, I think, by all of the Abrahamic faiths and some others, are that humans are made in God's image. And human life, therefore, has an intrinsic value, and the strong should make sacrifices for the weak. And these two are obviously in conflict with one another. Now, Rupert Sheldrake is generally regarded as being a rather maverick biologist, and I certainly would dissociate myself from some of his writings, but in his book, The Science Delusion, in the introduction, I think he makes a very, very valid point. And he says there the biggest scientific delusion of all is that science already knows the answers. It's only the details that need working out. In principle, the fundamental questions are settled. Well, certainly I think, Ali, after hearing your talk this morning, if I ever believed that before, I certainly don't believe it now. Contemporary science, Sheldrake says, is based on the claim that all reality is material. There is no reality apart from material reality. Consciousness is a byproduct of the physical activity of the brain. Matter is unconscious. Evolution is purposeless. And God exists only as an idea in human minds and hence in human heads. These beliefs are powerful not because most scientists think critically about them, but because they don't. And that's the clincher. The facts of science are real enough, but the belief system that governs conventional scientific thinking is an act of faith grounded in a 19th century ideology. I think Ali said this morning that we don't know what we don't know, and that is a problem for scientists as much as it is for people of faith. Now, Dawkins has the fervour of unquestioning fundamentalist certainty when he asserts in his 1992 book, The River Out of Eden, the following. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Some people are going to get lucky, and you will not find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we would expect if there is at the bottom of it no design, purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its tune. Now, it seems to me that Dawkins wants to have his moral cake and eat it. He specifically and explicitly denies here, quite logically following his naturalistic creed, that not only is there no basis for morality, but ultimately there is no such thing as morality anyway. There is no good or evil. So it's no wonder that he makes no real attempt to ground morality in the God delusion. And yet, at the same time, he makes a great deal of the fact, as I have said, that atheists can live just as good a life as religious believers. Now, I have no quarrel with that, but how can Dawkins make such a claim when, according to him, there is no good or evil anyway? It's little wonder that our very own Dr. John McDade here at St. Mary's, in his lectures on Nietzsche, finds the soft atheism of Dawkins and his ilk so much less consistent and satisfying than the hard atheism of Nietzsche, Sartre, and Camus, who clearly recognize that the existence of absolute values upon which the ethics of science and indeed anything else ultimately must rest do demand the existence of God. I will leave the last words of this talk to Professor Lennox, to whom, as I've said, I am deeply indebted for most of its content. He writes, "The new atheists do not seem to have taken on board the fact that their atheism removes from them not only their liberal values, but any moral values whatsoever. All of their criticism of God and religion are invalid, not so much because they are wrong, but because they are meaningless. If such a denial of ethics is at the heart of the God delusion hypothesis, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see where the delusion really lies. After all, if DNA neither knows nor cares that we dance to its music, how is it that most of us both know and care?" And just reflecting on Anthony's talk in the first part of the morning, I thought to myself, yeah, the dance of love rings true with most of us far, far more deeply than the dance of DNA. Thanks very much for your attention.